This is SoundNotion, the weekly podcast for new music and music news. I'm Dave McDonald.
I'm Nate Blyton.
I'm Sam Merciers.
And joining us this week is blogger and orchestra consultant and guy who knows everything that we would ever want to know about the orchestra business, Drew McManus. Friend of the show, Drew McManus. Thanks for joining us this morning, Drew.
Thanks for inviting me, guys.
So we, on this show, all the time, have the misfortune of talking about the misfortune of the orchestra business, especially in the United States. Over the last year and a half that we've been doing the show, we have talked about some truly disturbingly acrimonious labor relations in Detroit, in Louisville, in Philadelphia, and all over the place. And last week, or maybe 2 weeks ago now, we talked about the opposite of that for the first time on the show. We talked about an orchestra, the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra, who signed I think it was a 4-year deal. They have a 4-year CBA? Is that right?
It was 4 or 5 years. It was longer than the typical 3-year.
Yeah. And they did it a full year before their current contract expired, and there was no cattiness in the local newspapers, and it seemed to all go very pleasantly for all parties involved. And so we were hoping that you could maybe enlighten us and explain what is so different about this situation compared to the ones that we've talked about in the past.
Sure. In St. Louis, what I think makes this situation stand out a bit more from the others is the reasons you just mentioned are all key. The fact that it wrapped up earlier than what is typical means they had enough of an interest in being able to reach a settlement ahead of time to begin working on it sooner than later, as opposed to waiting to the last minute, which is something people will do when they think that there's going to be trouble down the road. It also demonstrates that even though the terms are nothing spectacular, it's actually quite vanilla, for that organization, it had gone through its own very contentious labor dispute back in 2003. And following that, going into the economic downturn, there were, I'm sure, more than a few folks who were wondering exactly how the group was going to fare in light of some of the other orchestras that you pointed out. So to be able to turn around and have both sides come out smiling, saying they came to a good agreement, took an extended period of time to give the group the stability they said they wanted to continue with the fiscal foundation building that they had in place, is important for the group to be able to build that credibility and attention, not just among local donors, but among national donors too.
Yeah, and I think something that we have noticed in the more dramatic situations that we've discussed is that there's a real lack of trust on either side that the other side really is going to be acting in the best interest of the organization as a whole. And I think that's something that's different here as well.
I think so too. You'd mentioned Philadelphia as one of the other examples of a contentious situation. And I don't know if you're on perhaps their PR list, but they released a press statement, I think last week, that really almost came across, at least parts of it came across as an advertisement for the bankruptcy firm. They actually listed how much money they saved in expenses based on what the actual settlement, like $2.5 million or so, to what they claimed were $100 million in expenses levied against them. It almost came across like a 1 a.m. ambulance chaser ad. And that attitude is one that of not letting a crisis go to waste, that whole point of view of trying to get whatever you can during a particularly bad economic downturn in concessions from your employees is an attitude that a lot of board members, a lot of executives have to fight against, because there's always going to be people who are trying to pick at that particular angle. So for St. Louis, a group that came out of their own labor dispute, to be able to turn around and avoid that kind of approach and attitude, when I'm sure there were probably at least a few voices wanting to consider that, then that's really an exceptional thing for them to do.
Do you think this is going to set a new precedent of real positive interaction with orchestra administrators?
I hope so. I hope it's going to be something that any board that's going to have this conversation, and they all will at some point in time if they haven't reached it already, is there's more value in coming up with a solution that allows you to consider an alternative besides substantial cuts, or even just trying to see what you can get out of a situation in the here and now.
So I was wondering, I was looking at the St. Louis Symphony's calendar, and they've got Wynton Marsalis is coming, and they're doing the music for Ray Charles, and soloist Kenneth Gorlick is going to be playing with the St. Louis Symphony.
Does it really say it that way? Does it say Gorlick?
No, it doesn't. That is, for those of you who don't know, that is Kenny G. Yeah, so, you know, obviously they're doing some things that orchestras have to do to put butts in the seats. But I'm wondering, like, I mean, this is a simple concept, and I guess I maybe should know, but, like, an orchestra making money, how much do they get from actually getting people at the concerts as far as that revenue, or is that just a way to inspire donors to give more money by, say, look, we're filling the hall up? You know what I mean?
Both. And that's actually something that's a bit of an issue right now in the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra situation, where their labor dispute is just beginning. The whole $5 ticket, $25 ticket aspect, and the idea of lowering the ticket prices to fill up the halls is to create an increased mojo to be able to get more money out of donors, to get, and there's, I'm at least one individual that believes that's a very good approach to it. Now, the other side of that is the income you're going to make from earned income, something like ticket sales, varies from one group to the next, but on average, most groups shoot for at least 1/3 of their annual revenue. Some groups are substantially lower, some are substantially higher. I don't know St. Louis's particular ratio, though. But that aspect of being able to put people in those seats, whether it be through programming, whether you have to spend a lot of money, like Boston Symphony pays a lot of money to James Taylor every year to come in, a lot more than they do classical soloists that come in. To be able to turn around and create something out of that without it impacting the revenue that will be lost through lower ticket sales or through soloists that may take money away from other artistic activities that bring in your core audience. Those are all the very difficult things that groups have to balance and hopefully find the right solution for.
Right. Well, I was wondering. Go ahead, Dave.
I was just gonna say, it's interesting, like you said, to see how far how quickly things can change in these groups. I grew up in St. Louis, and I remember, I think it was even when I was an undergrad, that they were going through some really nasty stuff. Maybe when I was in high school, they were going through some really nasty stuff with their labor relations. And just a few years later, everybody got really excited when they appointed a new music director, David Robertson. And I don't know if it's the excitement around that had anything to do with their turnaround, if that maybe helped them to get in a more comfortable financial situation. And obviously that makes all of these negotiations much easier if things are a little less tight. But now, they do a lot more, I think. I don't know what it is, but there's a lot more recognition around St. Louis of the symphony and the conductor. My parents, who live in St. Louis, are kind of the archetypical culturally aware non-attenders. And they go to other artistic things in the St. Louis area. They have season tickets to the local theater company, but they never go to St. Louis Symphony concerts. But they know they would recognize David Robertson, and I'm sure they would not have recognized Hans Vonk, the previous music director. And so I don't know if there's just a bit more verve around the symphony in the city because of that, and that has made all of this other stuff easier for them. But I'm wondering if that has anything to do with it. If things just that seem a little bit I don't know, maybe it seems cynical to say that marketing has an effect on things like these CBAs, but is that the case?
To a degree. I mean, it's not marketing in and of itself. I think what you're talking about is institutional vision. And when a group can get behind a single idea, and it won't just be a conductor or a music director, but it's a larger, unified, agreed upon vision of what the organization is, where it's going, and what it can accomplish. So it has goals. Another really good news story that's worth talking about, that's a perfect example of this, is the Nashville Symphony Orchestra in Nashville, Tennessee, where they spent a great deal of time building.
Sam's from Nashville. He gets very excited about Nashville. Or not from Nashville.
Tennessee. There's a lot of good orchestras in Tennessee, a lot for that size state. But in Nashville's case, they had their concert hall project, beautiful Schermerhorn Symphony Center with a fantastic concert hall. They've been to Carnegie twice now, just most recently this past year. But they were set up to be in a situation that has really hurt a lot of other orchestras, and they've been able to get past all of this more or less unscathed because of this unified institutional vision that's helped bring everyone together instead of having them fight for whatever they can during a downtime. And here's an example. They opened up the new concert hall, and very shortly, within I think a year and a half, if that long, after it opened up, Nashville was hit with those floods, if you remember. And the concert hall, the entire basement was destroyed and flooded. The HVA system had to be replaced. They were going to be out of the hall for months and months and months and months and months. It was a substantial amount of damage. Insurance covered most of the costs, but not all. So they had to do more fundraising on top of the fundraising they just came out of to put the hall in place. And they had to be out of this hall that was the whole purpose for them being able to increase their status in the local community. A lot of groups under those pressures, with the added expense of the building projects and their loans that they had just as much pressure as places like Detroit were under, could have easily collapsed. But instead, the organization went out of its way to be able to rally the support it had already built and remain true to its core purpose. I had a conversation with their executive and a number of their managers at that particular time when they were out of the hall. And I went back for their inaugural concert, and they have their own kitchen facilities because they have their own catering. And I took a tour through the new rebuilt facility in the basement, and the kitchen was one of the places that had been destroyed. And while walking around, I noticed, not just the head chef, but the sous chefs, the prep chefs, everybody's face I recognized. They were all the same people. And I turned to the executive and I said, how'd you guys get all your, kitchen staff to come back after being out of work for 8 or 9 months? How'd you be able to attract them back to this position? And he looked at me and said, well, we never got rid of them. Well, you didn't have a kitchen where you went to, so what did you do? He said, we understood that the value of these people to the organization, their skills, their knowledge, helping make that department work was important enough for us to be able to find ways to keep them. So we had them driving shuttle buses to get people to and from our new locations. We had them delivering mail. We had them working whatever department we could to be able to keep them on payroll, to pay them enough to make them want to stay with the organization, so that when we returned, we knew we'd be able to get up and running and have the same level of efficiency we had always had before the accident.
So when you tell that story, to me, that just sounds like people being nice. Like, why isn't everybody nice?
There's a lot of common sense that maybe doesn't follow through.
I suppose.
And that's, easier said than done to a certain degree, because there's still a bottom line. You still have to bring in money. But when you're talking to donors and when you're talking to people, that actually is, I think, one of the important things to really draw a real connection to the community. You're not just bringing in extraordinary musicians who live in the community, who teach your children and give these amazing concerts, but you extend past that into all the other employees that are part of the organization and why it's important for you to keep them there, which is the same thing as a commitment to the community itself.
So we've talked about St. Louis and we've talked about Nashville. Where's some other orchestras that are really doing things different in a good way, doing things right?
Well, I think one of the things often overlooked is the simple stuff. Debt management. It is bad. People are having to have cutbacks. They need to find ways to maintain what they're doing, but not at the risk of losing the things that will cost you later. You may save money now, but what's the real price on that long term? Here in Chicago Symphony is a great example of that. They have had the same debt problems that everyone else has had. The musicians did take a concession at one point in time, but now the organization is back to not the same levels of spending, but more that than they were away from it. They brought in Riccardo Muti. He had some health problems early on, but now he's back. They weathered all of that. Those are the kind of examples that I think deserve attention because they're not flashy, they're not extraordinary, they're not particularly sexy, just like the St. Louis terms in their agreement. But those sorts of accomplishments in this environment are extraordinary.
That's interesting that in another environment they probably would just be kind of ho-hum, but it's just in comparison to everything else that's going on around them that we find them spectacular.
Right, and it's in all different size budget orchestras. Dayton Philharmonic is another really good one, where they've done an excellent job of maintaining for a regional orchestra their pay level, and they've just embarked on what is typically an extremely difficult process, which is to look at arts organization mergers, which more often than not, I'm not a huge fan of, and there are some really terrible examples out there of them. But they actually were able to put together, I think, one of the only mergers that I've seen in at least 10 years that was really done the right way. And I think the organization and the new greater organization that combined the opera and the ballet is going to be even stronger.
Interesting. So, if unless you have anything else to say on these good news stories, I kind of want to ask you about these compensation reports on Adaptistration. So, how long have you been doing these compensation reports?
Well, I've got two sets of figures. There's the figures at the premium site, which actually go all the way back to the 1999-2000 season. But I think the first season we launched at the blog site was 2005.
Okay.
Check it, tell you for sure.
So you've got several years worth, and on the premium site, it seems like I guess that's a little over a decade of figures on how much people at different levels of these large orchestral organizations are making, and I look at them each year when they come out on the blog, and I'm never quite sure what I should be learning from them, except that the music director of the Philadelphia Orchestra makes a lot more money than I do. So explain to me maybe what the value of this information is to people in the field of the orchestra business, and also people like us who are just more observers of orchestra business.
Sure. There's always going to be that tabloid-esque fascination with
Absolutely.
sound, because people are always titillated by it. But in the nonprofit sector, which is what orchestras are, the IRS has put together a set of rules based on a philosophy, actually, where they have to report these figures and make them publicly available, because an organization that's entrusted with doing public good, which all nonprofits are, there's a certain degree of responsibility that these organizations have in their transparency to be able to demonstrate what they're spending their money on, that they're raising from the other individuals and donors, so that those donors and supporters and ultimately the board members, the stewards of public trust, are able to determine whether or not that organization is following through on its promise of being a part of the community and doing the public good that it says it will.
So what is the reaction usually when you publish these things? What kind of feedback and response do you get?
Over the years, it's been a mixed bag. I mean, there are people who tend to focus on that tabloid-esque aspect of it, where they people are say, hooray for you, you're being a great guy for going out and telling everyone what these people make, and isn't it awful that they make so much money? And I think that's the wrong attitude to take. And you get the people who are offended by it. How dare you talk about people's salaries? That's private. And that's also the wrong point, because it's a nonprofit organization. The real value is in examining the real value, actually, of accountability. How important is that? There's something we talk about in the compensation reports more some years than others, not so much this time, but it's the concept of rewarding effort versus achievement. And I usually hit that point hard in the compensation reports, because there's working hard, but there's actually meeting goals. And are you being rewarded for one or the other? And that's a very difficult thing for boards of directors to do in orchestras. And when you have something like the bad news stories, like the Philadelphia and Detroit and Louisville, that becomes a very crucial issue. But when you turn around to the good news stories in St. Louis and Nashville and Chicago, Dayton, you look at what those individuals make, and you start to get a different sense of how important it is to know what these figures are, as to whether or not these people are actually accomplishing whatever it is the organization's supposed to be doing.
And I think, though, maybe one of the problems that I have in wheedling that information out of this big list is that it's really hard to compare across these different markets. Like the Dayton Symphony is never going to have the same budget as the Chicago Symphony.
Right.
And so those numbers are always going to be lower. And so I guess maybe it's in the comparison, that year-to-year comparison, going back through the archives, where you really can figure out what that value is. Again, that effort to accomplishment ratio. Does that make sense? So it's. I think when I'm looking at these, it's still difficult for me to figure out what I learned from knowing about the Dayton numbers, because I don't have an appropriate appreciation for the difference between Dayton and Chicago, I guess.
Well, Sam, you were going to say something?
Well, I think it might be the first thing I thought I would like to see is like another column that has a percentage. How much of the CEO compensation is the budget? You know what I mean? Because while the Los Angeles Philharmonic, the CEO he's the only one that makes over $1 million, if I saw that correctly. And that seems like an enormous amount of money, but almost 97 million was what the Los Angeles Philharmonic spent. So, I would like to know what that percentage is, and I could figure it all out myself, or I could enter it all in Excel and figure it out, or whatever.
Right. That's a common question.
Go ahead.
I was going to say that's one of the most common questions I get every year, and that's, I think, one of the first points of reference that people try to reach to. But it doesn't scale into the greater perspective of the entire field and the differences between those budgets. Because, yes, the larger the budget, the smaller the ratio is of the executive compensation, until you get down to the $2 million budget range, although this year I raised the cutoff point to $2.5 million. With that ratio, we'll see much, much larger. But I actually don't want people to make that comparison to be able to base what Deborah Borda makes in LA to what Paul Helfrich makes in Dayton, because it is a little bit of actually it's a lot of apples and oranges built into it. Yes, the executives in lower budget orchestras make a larger ratio, and there is a point to where that ratio should become a concern. But those are exactly the type of questions that I hope people start to think about, which I think maybe is one of the real strengths of the compensation reports, is it gets people thinking about their organizations outside of just the artistic accomplishments.
Right. What is typically indicated in the column for CEO compensation when it says not applicable?
Oh, it's a couple of things. Sometimes you'll have a situation where an organization will be between CEOs, or you'll have a CEO that left and one came in, so you don't have a really fair representation of what the annual expenditure was. That's the most common reason. especially for music directors, because they'll go for an extended period of time before they put someone into place, whereas a CEO will typically be put into place very quickly. There are a very few tiny situations where groups won't report the numbers. Now, more often than not, I'll call the organization, ask what the compensation figures are, and they'll be happy to give them, because it was usually an oversight that they weren't included in the Form 990. But there have been a few instances over the years where groups have just said, no, we're not going to give you the numbers. We just don't think we have to, and, you know, push comes to shove, you can go out and call the IRS. We don't really care.
Okay.
I'm not particularly fond of that point of view, and I don't think it's right. I think they would lose if it came to that. But I am happy to say that of the groups that have taken that point of view, they've always changed it the following year, and it's been reported.
Interesting.
Okay. Interesting.
I think I just looked at the quick facts down at the bottom, and this is actually, you know, I don't know if I'm thinking this sounds good just because I'm an American, you know, and that's the way I want things to be. The average executive compensation decreased by 6.05%, and the average total orchestra expenditure increased. So the top dogs took less money, and at least you could make the you could put forth the idea that then they took that savings and they spent it towards whatever, you know, another trombone player or what have you.
Well, that's, again, a perfect example of the kind of things I hope people are thinking about. That didn't happen in every single organization. And the expense income structure of orchestras is typically reactive. So you'll have expenses that were put into place that you can't control as far as increases. But there are some that you can cut right away. And one of them is going to be through administrative salaries and expenditures. Interestingly enough, with that American social populist kind of point of view, is in the executive changes. If you look at the levels of budget and the change from one year to the next, you'll actually see more executives at the top of the list who are the higher earners have increases, whereas the decreases were absorbed more among the middle and lower budget orchestra executives.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Interesting. So, Drew, I know we've been picking your brain all morning about this, but is there like a dark horse orchestra out there that has been struggling, but you have high hopes that they're turning things around now?
This is like basketball season.
Yeah, so that we can root for them. Give us a long shot so we can put some long money on them and maybe get rich.
Oh, actually, I did an article about that years and years ago before the economic downturn of what I thought were the top 5 or 6 orchestras with the most amount of promise. I'd have to probably revisit that, but one group I would take a look at right now I think is worthwhile is Oregon Symphony. I think they did a good job of finding themselves in a very negative financial position. They had a concert hall project that kind of fell apart. And they had an executive they brought in, Elaine Calder, who did a really good job. She just recently left, unfortunately, and will be leaving at the end of this summer. But if they can get the right person back in place, I think they can continue building off of the stabilization they put under extremely difficult circumstances to be able now to start to move back up instead of operating at this new low.
Awesome.
Cool. So should we move into our news stories this week?
Yes, absolutely.
If you're one of the many people like me who missed this great concert in New York last weekend, as we're recording this the first weekend of July, this was the last weekend of June, the New York Philharmonic took over the Park Avenue Armory and performed some kind of rare gems of the orchestral repertoire, these kind of gargantuan pieces that don't get performed very often because they're gargantuan and expensive to put on. Notably, Stockhausen's Gruppen, which is for 3 orchestras, all on separate stages with separate conductors. And
what you're trying to say, Dave, is pieces that are more trouble than they're worth.
Well, I don't know if I would go that far, but I've never seen a live performance. I kind of wanted to go. I think this was the first performance in probably 20 or 25 years or so. and I unfortunately couldn't go to New York to see it. And if you are like me, you can go to Medici.tv, which is a fantastic concert streaming service, and you can, I don't know how long it's going to be free, I think for like 90 days or something, stream the whole concert. The program was Stockhausen's Gruppen, Ives' Unanswered Question, and something else. But you should definitely check that out because it is free and should be pretty fantastic. Another New York Philharmonic story, Alec Baldwin of Twitter fame. I'm going to go with Twitter.
Words with Friends fame.
He of Words with Friends and getting kicked off airplanes fame and Capital One fame, donated $1 million, the proceeds from his Capital One campaign appearances, to the New York Philharmonic Orchestra, which is pretty exciting. He's kind of been a very high-profile arts philanthropist for many years, and seems to have been increasing his exposure in classical music over the last few years. Sam, I think it was you that I told this to last week, and you had some thoughts about it.
What, about Alec Baldwin?
About Alec Baldwin and giving $1 million to the New York Philharmonic.
I don't think it was me.
Oh, well, maybe it wasn't you. But so I told this to a friend of mine, and they said, well, that's great, but he really should have given it. Oh, it was Tim. It was Tim Rosenberg. I was talking to Tim Rosenberg, who I do Music is Hard with. And he said, well, that's great, but you know what would have been really awesome is if he'd given it to the Brooklyn Philharmonic. Because they don't have $1 million, and gosh darn it, they need it, and they deserve it.
Or how about the Brooklyn Secondary School System Music Education Program?
Sure.
Something other than I'm all for the New York Philharmonic staying in business, and although I think Gruppen is a little too much, like I said, more trouble than it's worth.
Get out.
However,
you're not on the show anymore.
$1 million would mean a lot more to someone much smaller than the New York Philharmonic. But you know,
I don't know. Is that
sure? I think Sam touched on that's one of the most contentious issues, I think, in the business right now, especially in the philanthropic community, because that discussion goes on among major founders or major funders throughout the foundations. And I have this conversation with boards and board development projects to wrap their minds around this. And I don't think it's always the best point of view to take the approach of, well, some group needs the money, so they should have the money. There's a lot into why did they get there to begin with, and whether or not they're going to be able to do as much with that money as the New York Phil might be able to do with that money. Because maybe the New York Phil will funnel it into their education program, maybe they'll do it into a new music program. You don't know. And I do think there's a strong value in rewarding groups that do well, to be able to reinforce whatever it is that they're doing well. So those are the subjective conversations that you have to have. There's no clear answer, I think, in this particular situation. But I would always shy away from wanting to say that this group really needs the money, so they should have it, because they'll be able to accomplish more. Maybe.
It depends organization by organization, you know.
Some might throw, some might just use to throw keggers after every concert.
That's right.
Well, you know, I didn't think it was succinct enough a story to put on the doc for this week, but friend of the show, David Smoot, tweeted about, I think it was him, where someone wrote a long response to Bill Maher, because during a monologue, Bill Maher had been talking about arts funding, and he basically said that classical music doesn't need any help. And he said, you know, people who live in palaces don't need help. And he showed, I don't know, some symphony hall and picked, you know, from any one of many around the country that look like palaces.
This was on Real Time. This was on the last episode of Real Time, I think.
Yeah. And, you know, it's easy. And while I'm one that kind of says that kind of thing, too, I would be the last person who'd want it to get stuck in people's minds that classical music doesn't need help because, look, they live in castles or whatever.
Yeah,
but,
they all wear tuxes and, like,
but they're always dressed to the nines, and they play in a palace. And I think it's just worth pointing out what a tight wire public perception can be for an institution like classical music that does have a lot of pomp and circumstance involved with it, but also exists mainly on subsidies of one sort or another. So,
yeah, but I think it's one thing to say that, to return to the Alec Baldwin thing. I think it's one thing to say that the Brooklyn Philharmonic is more needy, which makes them sound pathetic, but more needy than the New York Philharmonic. But I really do think they deserve it because they're doing some really amazing things. And Alec Baldwin is a self-proclaimed New Yorker, and they're right down the street. So anyway, perhaps this $1 million could be used to offset some of the $200,000 that they tried to give to Henri Dutilleux last week. And I was dumb and accidentally cut this from the rundown last week, and I want to make sure we mention it this week. Alan Gilbert and people from the New York Philharmonic organization flew to Paris, I guess, last week, and gave composer Henri Dutilleux this $200,000 award for being an awesome composer who's had an incredible career, and they said, here's $200,000, and we would love for you to write us this piece, and we'll play it next season. And Dutilleux took this $200,000 and thought to himself, I know some pretty good composers too, and so he has decided to take that money and spend $150,000 of it to commission 3 other composers, and give 3 other composers $50,000 each to write a new piece for the New York Philharmonic as well, which is very exciting and a very an incredible gesture from a really amazing composer, Henri Dutilleux. So we look forward to hearing what comes of those commissions.
He picked the composers.
Yes, he is. They're handpicked by Dutilleux. You cannot apply to be Henri Dutilleux's buddy, $50,000 buddy. So, do you have any thoughts on these?
Yeah, I think it's a really great idea, and it's fabulous that he was able to have the courage, because it does take a great deal of courage to re-gift that money like that.
Yeah.
But I think that's an equally as good of a story as the Alec Baldwin story. I was actually really glad to see the Alec Baldwin story because, again, on a larger philanthropic, large donor giving mentality, there's a bit of a problem inside the philanthropic world in general of reminding those who have money the value of giving money. And so to have somebody like Alec Baldwin, who's going to be a larger public figure, give this money and do it in a public way, but not do it to look like he's trying to get a lot of just attention and PR out of it, I think does contribute a great deal to remind people that classical music is important. Their orchestral organizations are important to their community. And regardless of what giving level you're at, paying attention to and giving these gifts has a large positive impact.
Mm-hmm. Right. Absolutely. By the way, the composers are Anthony Chang, Sean Shepard, and Peter
Itvers.
I don't know. It's got 2 O's, both of which have the 2 dots over them.
Itvers.
And I got no clue what to do with that one.
I'm actually saying his name for you.
Okay. All right.
I'm not just making noises.
As usual, the pronounce-a-Dave is in full effect.
I only know it because it was in this video that I watched last week.
Nice.
And it stuck in my head, and I thought to myself, I'm going to have to say that guy's name on SoundNotion. I'm going to pay attention. So, Drew, could you either turn down your volume a little bit or plug in your headphones? Because we're getting a tiny bit of feedback from you. Thank you. Another story this week, and this is something I found a little alarming. Avid, who bought Sibelius from the Finn brothers who first created it.
We mean the notation program Sibelius, not like
right,
the Sibelius,
not the remains of the finished
not the
composer.
Bones of the Elephant Man Sibelius?
No, not him either. The software, the music notation software Sibelius, is owned by Avid, has been owned by Avid for, I don't know, 3-4 years now. And they have announced this week that they are going to move Sibelius development to somewhere in Eastern Europe where it can be done cheaper. And there are a lot of people worried. First, when this was first announced, they had made some announcements about the future of a lot of Avid software products, and Sibelius was not on the list. And a lot of people thought they were just going to drop Sibelius, which would be pretty disastrous for me and other people who use Sibelius primarily.
Half the composer community.
Right. Well, I wouldn't say half. I still think Sibelius is kind of in a minority as being the new-ish kid on the block. Notationally, but there are a lot of people that use it that would have been in a pretty big jam. And in fact, Rob Deemer just had a great post on New Music Box on, I guess, Friday, in which he included a bit of a survey of a bunch of different composers. And I said that Sibelius is in the minority, but of the 20 composers who responded to his survey, he got 7 Finale users and 12 Sibelius users and 1 who uses both. So I guess it's bigger than I thought. But I mean, there are a lot of composers who would be pretty out of luck if Sibelius went away. But I'm pretty concerned about this move of the development team to somewhere else. They're going to get rid of the people that were involved in creating this thing. It was kind of a tech startup in as much as there were such things in the late 80s and mid 90s when Sibelius was being created for the first time. And as a long-term Sibelius user, I've always known that I can get in contact with people who have direct connections to the development team. And if I go to the Sibelius website and log on to the Sibelius user forum thing, which has horrible forum software, but has great feedback from a guy named Daniel Spreadbury. And I don't know Daniel Spreadbury's title, but he wrote the Sibelius user guide, which is hilariously written. And I know that if he doesn't understand something, he can walk down the hall and talk to the guy who's writing the code. And I really fear losing that direct connection with the development team. I don't know how you guys feel about this. I know Sam and Nate, you guys are Finale people, and I guess I'm the only regular panelist who's a Sibelius person because Patrick's a Finale person too. What do you guys think?
I use both a teeny bit.
Okay. So what do you think about moving the development to Ukraine?
I mean, that does sound like as a thing of like sending development overseas and getting not having the people that you've always had. Like, if nothing else, then the changeover might have a lull in the customer support. And I don't know. As a Finale user, each time they would come out with a new version, there'd be so many problems that like, we don't.
Nate, we're kind of losing you. Can you speak up a little bit?
Sorry. It is a fearful thing, losing the customer support, at least in this lull. And yeah, I don't use Sibelius as much for sure, but I guess we'll have to see what happens. I don't know.
I mean, I get that this is a big cost-saving measure, and I get that it will be very effective at doing that. But I'm happy to pay another couple $100 for Sibelius every 2 years to support the people that have built this thing from the ground up, and to have a better contact with the people that can actually solve my problems when I have problems. And I don't know. We have the same issue with hardware as well, right? All our hardware devices are made in China, and there was the big to do with the journalistically questionable was the Mike Daisy thing with the Foxconn factory and the Apple products, and there was a lot of research done around that time, and the estimated increase in cost for making stuff in the U.S. was not that much more. It was like maybe 20% tops. more, and I would absolutely pay 20% more for Sibelius, but I think Avid is counting on bringing in maybe new customers that would offset my extra 20% that I would be willing to pay.
It's a bad move.
Yeah.
And as someone who is a technology provider, and for years I've forestalled getting into the technology service that I deliver to arts organizations now called the Venture Platform, because I wasn't able to actually get the cost structure where it needed to be. But there was always the option of outsourcing. I could use, Eastern European, or I could use Southeast Asian programmers that were going to cost a lot less money. But it was important to get a North American programmer, to get the hosting company in North America, to get the email marketing service in North America. And in the last couple of years, those costs and that entire structure has gone down considerably to be able to offer as high of a quality product without having to pass that cost along ultimately to the people who are going to be using the service who don't always have that money. So I was extremely disappointed to see that they were doing it and moving the development to Ukraine, losing those original coders and developers. And you just can't plug that kind of creative inspiration back into the product at any point in time down the road without expecting to see major problems and shortfalls. I really wish they just released it into the wild as an open source project and just allowed people to fork it and take the project on in a larger community sense.
And that's the solution that a lot of people keep proposing for something like this. But there's no open source, and I'm a huge advocate of open source things. I use a lot of open source stuff in my life. But there's no open source notation software that will do for me what Sibelius does. There is some great open source engraving software that is great for typesetting, but it's terrible for actually composing in. It will not replace Sibelius in that sense. If I've got a score written, I can typeset it in, is it Lily Pond, and it will look fantastic, but it's written in text. You type essentially code to make this score, and it looks fantastic, but it's not reasonable for writing in. And
which is more expensive, Sibelius or Finale?
It depends how you measure it. I think maybe Sibelius is a little bit more expensive, but new versions don't come out as often.
Not every year. They would come out with one every half year if they could, I think.
Sibelius is on an every other summer cycle, and this is an off summer. So
there's Finale is every year.
Yeah.
Every stinking year.
So I mean, it's hard to argue with the values of open source, but sometimes the products leave a little to be desired.
Absolutely. If you have a good foundation to work with, and assuming I haven't looked at the Sibelius code close enough to know exactly how well it would work in the open source environment, but open source is so much more organized, even though it doesn't sound that way, than it used to be, where there are project teams and even nonprofit organizations and for-profit organizations whose business is nothing but establishing open source and running open source communities. And something like Sibelius has got what open source is best designed for, which is a really well-defined niche market that needs very much the service or program that's being delivered.
Exactly.
I would love to see the structure behind the development of like a program like Audacity or something. I don't know anything about that, but it works so well and it comes out with new versions so rarely. But it has also come such a long way in the past.
It works. It does its job. You know, we use it in our studio setup to record audio sometimes. So I mean, it's production ready when it doesn't crash. And
it crashes way less often than it used to.
We'll count that in the win column. So yeah, and you can't be told. I tweeted about this a lot this week, and I got a response from a friend of mine who's used Avid products of all sorts for many years, and he says, "Well, this is nothing new. They did the same thing to Pro Tools. They're doing the same thing to the M Audio hardware devices. All that development's moving to places where it's cheaper to hire developers. And, it's sad, but it's true.
Basically, Dave is afraid he's going to be like that Capital One credit card commercial where you call for assistance and, hello, this Peggy. You know the one I'm talking about.
Yeah. I don't want to talk to Peggy. I want to talk to Daniel Spreadberry. At D Spreadberry on Twitter. And I feel like I know this guy. I had to deal with him a lot more in the early days of Sibelius before it got awesome. Back when it was just usable. So speaking of not paying people what they're worth, and speaking of not paying people in the UK what they're worth, there are a lot of peripheral events. All right, and hopefully John Williams and his estate do not send a DMCA copyright takedown request for our video.
That wasn't in tune enough. That wasn't in tune enough to qualify as his
perhaps
season.
Not. But there are a lot of peripheral arts events surrounding the Olympics, and some of the musicians are being asked to play for free in exchange for the exposure.
Yes.
And
in related news, the Olympics to hire middle schoolers to play.
Yeah.
Because those are the people that will do it for the exposure.
The people that are doing it for the exposure are the people that aren't good enough to get it while also getting paid.
That's correct.
So
you shouldn't have said middle schoolers, because I'm sure there's a few middle schoolers out there who could hack the gig.
Right. So the point is, by not paying anybody, they're going to get what they paid for, and we're going to be subjected to some crappy music. This is not, we should say, like the opening ceremonies that are on television in 7 billion homes around the world. These are kind of ancillary events to the Olympics, but dumb nonetheless. Should we save the Alan Turing story? Maybe we should mention Alan Turing because it was his birthday. Alan Turing, who's a very early computer scientist and all-around awesome dude,
pretty much the guy,
would have celebrated his 100th birthday this last week, and in honor of Turing's 100th birthday, the London Philharmonic Orchestra premiered a work written entirely by a computer. So, Sam, do you want to tell us about the live performance of a piece written by a computer?
Well, it's important, I think, to point out that Alan Turing, kind of his claim to fame, he was like a computer scientist before computers even really existed.
Right.
He kind of invented the way a computer will think in his brain and sort of proved things about things that computers can do before the computers that proved those things ultimately to be the fact even existed.
Correct.
And one of the more famous things that he came up with was a thing where
his test for artificial intelligence.
Yeah, so you're trying to tell whether the questions being asked you are being responded to by a computer or a person, and kind of inspired the opening scene of Blade Runner, if anybody's familiar with that. But anyway, so this is a piece that was composed by a computer. Now, I have some questions, and it doesn't get into exactly, like, did the computer come up with every frequency, everything, or did they give it something that it used to develop into a piece?
Right.
That's not explicitly made clear, I don't think, in the article.
This is something that always comes up with these things, is like how much input, or how much control does the computer actually have? Because does the computer really have as much control as I have when I sit down at a blank sheet of paper? Probably not.
No. Most computers can't actually do anything unless some human tells them to do something. That's kind of a thing about computers.
Thank goodness we have a computer expert on the panel.
Right.
It is an interesting story just because they play a piece that, making whatever considerations to the the kernel of data that it used to generate this piece, it was a piece that was completely generated and notated past that by a computer. And there's a quote in here where a guy says that it sounds better than a lot of the avant-garde music that he runs across in his daily life by, quote, real composers. There isn't a reference to a piece that was written without any help by humans at all, and they call it a bland, arpeggiated compositions. Said to sound like a technically skilled child trying to ape Beethoven or Bach, or like Michael Nyman on a bad day, fine for elevators, but not for the concert hall. So that's
There's a blurb.
That's a pull quote for the website, right?
Yeah. Well, Michael Nyman is the guy that thinks that the British government should pay every single citizen to write an opera. Or at least that's what we were able to extrapolate from his sort of nonsensical statement he made several weeks ago that we covered on the show.
Should we hang on to this?
It's also worth mentioning there's a really good Alan Turing sort of overview biography thing that NPR did, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes. He was very much persecuted by the British government for being gay, and it was just some nasty things went down in his life away from his computer genius.
I was going to suggest that we hang on to this Twitter article for a week, but I think it would be interesting to talk to Drew about it. So let's just go ahead and do it. Bob Shingleton over at an Overgrown Path blog has written it's a piece that certainly contravenes a lot of what Sam and I like to talk about. And this piece is called "Classical Music's Love Affair with Twitter is Misguided," and it's written in that tone of voice. And he makes a lot of, I think, salient observations about Twitter that are absolutely spot on. That there are a lot of there's a lot of bad PR writing that happens on Twitter. And he really focuses on the worst of Twitter and how much people spend on hiring social media consultants, and how Twitter is not good for broadcasting to tons and tons of people. And I think all those things are absolutely true. And what Twitter is good at is the same thing that a lot of social media services are good at, and that's connecting people with other people. And it's not very good at connecting people with, as much as Facebook would like to convince its investors that people are on Facebook to connect with their favorite products and brands, they're not on Facebook to connect with their favorite products and brands. Anybody who has a favorite brand is probably a douchebag, and you don't want to connect with them anyway.
Another good blurb.
Exactly. So the people that he's complaining about are the people that suck at Twitter. And the people that are good at Twitter are doing a lot of great things for classical music, I think. The people that are having fun on Twitter. Things like, we talked about LSO on Tour 1912. If you didn't follow LSO on Tour 1912, I'm sure it's still up there. It was a fantastic idea. The London the London Symphony Orchestra was on tour in the United States for the first time in 1912, right around the time the Titanic sunk. In fact, they were supposed to originally take the Titanic over to the U.S. and change their travel schedule pretty late in the game. So this guy had kept a diary, and this LSO on Tour Twitter account was tweeting excerpts from this diary exactly 100 years after they were originally written. So you can follow this account and follow this tour, and that's a great use of Twitter. And it's not, come to our concert. It's, hey, this is pretty neat. Maybe you'll connect with somebody that you like here in our organization and be inclined to support them. Hillary Hahn does not tweet as herself, but instead tweets as @ViolinCase and tweets in the persona of her violin case. She doesn't say, hey, come to my show tomorrow night, which is the crappy way to use Twitter. She lets you connect with her as a person through this violin case account, and then maybe you'll be inclined to want to attend on your own.
I like that. So not necessarily like, come to my concert, it'll be really interesting, but instead just being really interesting on the internet, and then having people connect the dots, hopefully, and show up.
That's exactly what it is.
The point he's making, like, he's kind of just saying Twitter is bad all around. It's sort of his point. And that's like saying email is bad all around, or, printed text is bad all around. Any of those things can be used in a dumb way. And he doesn't mention any point during the story a good use for Twitter, or anyone who has done a good job with Twitter, or anything it works well at, which to me makes the rest of his argument pretty much like he undercuts his own argument by showing, or at least seemingly demonstrating, that he doesn't have a very good understanding of what he's talking about.
I think he knows what he's talking about. I think he's just dwelling on the worst of it. And, you know, he talks about Twitter being bad at getting a hold of a lot of people, and that a lot of classical music is a lot of little niches. And that's absolutely true. But I think Twitter is great at interacting with the niche for whatever you're doing. And it's a self-selecting group that follows you on Twitter, right? They're following you because they want to know what you have to say. And of course people use Twitter and, you know, pipe Twitter feeds into a web page or something that everybody sees. But still the primary use is for people that are actively choosing to follow your tweets, getting them, right? This is not... It's kind of a broadcast medium, but it's broadcasting to a select few. So maybe narrowcasting.
I don't think you're ever going to get rid of that negative, smarmy kind of, you know, PR regurgitation aspect that I think this piece rails against, and I think it does so properly. But Twitter, I think, works best for classical music and for performing arts in general by being an experience force multiplier. You're able to expand what an experience is to a larger group that would otherwise not be able to participate in real time. Some of the most fun I've had working on Twitter is at conferences, which are traditionally really dull because you only get to experience with the people there. Maybe there's something fantastic going on, and there's no one else you can share it with. But when you get a conference that has hundreds and hundreds of tweets going on during an individual session that expands the discussion past just the 3 or 4 people sitting up at the table up front controlling the conversation, that's really what Twitter is fantastic at. And it runs into a lot of problems in classical music application because the concert hall experience, and can you actually have someone clicking away on their phone while the concert's going on and so forth, those are all problems that will have answers. But being able to share that experience and getting people, I think, to the point to where they're comfortable enough sharing and expounding on their thoughts, feelings, and interpretation of what's going on in the live experience, I think is where the entire Twitter platform is going to have the most value for classical music.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, the issue of tweeting in concerts, I don't know if that's really that big an issue. I don't know how many people that go to classical music concerts know what Twitter is, but even if they do, as long as they're not making any noise, we should get over the backlight on the phone issue in concerts. Like, we should be grown up enough to ignore the visual thing, and if they're not making any noise, whatever. Is it really that much more distracting than the person next to you reading a magazine, which I have experienced? I don't think so.
I would love for phones to adopt so they've got airplane mode. If they made like an orchestra mode where it kind of only lights up a little bit, just enough for you to see the text.
A very high contrast black backlit screen. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Good luck having these conversations with boards of directors, or because I have this all the time, and there is a huge pushback against promoting and encouraging that sharing of the actual real time live concert experience.
Yeah. That's, well, I don't know how to solve that. That's a big issue. But I just got a great idea for a startup. I'm going to pitch you guys a startup. You ready for this? We make a classical concert Twitter client that's all very dark colors in all the interfaces and doesn't have a lot of white on the screen at any time. So it's all very dark. Those AMOLED screens that are on these mobile devices can get very dark. This is the new thing. That's
good. You also need shortcut keys for umlauts and special characters.
Ooh, now you're talking. Now you're talking.
And you have a nice quick pick list of all the terms and vocabulary and nomenclature that goes along with it. So even if you don't know it, it's there, and it has the little English definition next to it, so you can use the words that look like you know what you're talking about.
Yeah, classical music spell check.
Yeah.
Correct your spelling of Peter Utves.
Or like buzzword, like just like one for Bravo, one for oh my gosh, freestanding ovations or like.
That's what
Yeah,
you need.
they
You need
do set up
buzzword,
photon.
like a button to insert a random buzzword.
Well, you also need it. The client should disable your flash on your camera such that you have to turn it on per picture. So if you were using it in the during the intermission, you could take a picture outside in the foyer, but you'd have to turn it on. But if you're going to try and sneak a picture during a concert, it will always disable the flash.
There you go.
There you go.
I like
Knight
where this is
Foundation.
going. We just created a multi-$100 business.
Well, all you need some startup from a foundation. If anybody from the Knight Foundation, which is big into online journalism right now in classical music to begin with, this is a good idea that they should fund.
All right.
There we go. I have one more bone to pick with an overgrown path.
Oh dear.
Quote, Twitter is a lazy solution and its commercial use does little more than inflate the communication agency's bottom line and the musician's ego at the expense of more important players, literally, in the music supply chain. I just think he can't support that statement. He can't pretend like what he's saying has any justification and truth. Like that's all relying on dogmatic understanding of something to get people to ascend to his point of view, in my opinion. Twitter is neither a lazy nor a not lazy solution. It's just something that can be done or not done. And saying Twitter is a lazy solution is irresponsible to me.
What if he rewrote it as in the way Twitter is being used by classical music organizations presently, followed by everything else he said?
Yeah. Can be a lazy solution. Yes, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
I got the sense that he was talking more from that point of view.
I understand, but still, I think people are so quick to jump on an I've been experiencing the I hate Twitter vibe in relationship to trying to get a disc golf club to jump into the 21st century. So I fight Twitter hatred all the time.
And in academia.
Yeah, and in academia you do too. Because people think Twitter is Justin Bieber. So if you're involved with Twitter, you care what Justin Bieber has to say is kind of the direct line of thought people make. And it also makes me wonder how much are like these social media consultants or whatever getting paid, because I can't imagine if all you're doing is managing one person's social media. I don't care how active you are about it. It's not a full-time job, and it's not worth thousands and thousands of dollars a month, that's for sure.
You would be surprised at what some people make. That and SEO is still a business that makes huge amounts of money, even for classical music organizations. I've got clients who fret nonstop about what if their SEO is set properly. And yeah, it is a huge market that people just build thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of dollars out of arts organizations unnecessarily.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
I mean, like if you just make good stuff, your SEO will take care of itself. That's it.
Yeah.
Especially with the new changes in the way Google has revamped all of its SEO.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's about making good content, not about... anyway.
Yeah.
We could do a whole show about that kind of stuff.
And perhaps someday we will. But
Perhaps
that's a topic
someday
for
we
another
will.
day. Should we move on to our pick of the week? Or...
Well, real quick,
Oh, okay.
Evelyn Lear passed away, I think it was last Sunday, a week from today, at 86. Popular soprano, started in Europe and became very popular, and then became really well known in the United States after that for singing some very difficult roles. Her preeminent thing, like the big thing that she was known for, was Lulu. So anyway, rest in peace. There's a great sort of retrospective of her life and homage to her, written by Anne Majette, and I'll link to that too.
Great. So our pick of the week this week actually is a Sam Mercier's selection. This is a piece by, I'm going to go with Tansy Davies, British composer. Sam, do you want to maybe introduce this piece a little bit? We're going to listen to an excerpt from Women in Love.
Well, this, like a lot of the composers I've been finding on the Non-Classical, which is a label in the UK, and other smaller labels, is that it ranges. We're in the United States, if somebody's an indie classical, their stuff is going to sound pretty indie classical all the time. She seems to have a big mix of big orchestral acoustic sounding, all the way to stuff that sounds like the most obscure, noodly little electronic thing that you can think of. So it really spans the gamut. And this new release, I've sampled everything on the new release, and I haven't found a single thing that I didn't think sounded very interesting and didn't bear repeated listenings. But today we're going to be listening to, I guess you could call it a song cycle or something.
It's a song cycle, I would say.
Yeah, so this is A Woman in Love, and there's, how many episodes are on the way I'm looking at it doesn't list it.
I think 7.
So anyway, they're all really cool. Some are done with, some have 2 singers, and some only have 1. But anyway.
So her site says that it's a piece for solo vocalist and solo percussionist.
Okay.
And the percussionist is playing bongos, bodhrán, and bass drum, which is an interesting combination of sounds to go with an otherwise unaccompanied soprano. It's very cool stuff. So we'll play a little excerpt from, this is called Women in Love. It's on the Tansy Davies album, Troubadours. This is the song What I Write Now.
What I write now, I write with grief and pain. Those troubadours of a previous generation, dead now, committed a most grievous sin, and through they broke into dark.
So that's a little excerpt from Women in Love by Tansy Davies. It's a really interesting vocal style. It's very not classical. It's the kind of the straighter tone that I often associate with the style that would be used in early music performance, and also kind of interestingly a little bit closer to something that you would hear in indie rock. Would you say, Sam?
Oh, absolutely. I always say, if you're making music that requires you to sing in tune, sing in tune. The rest is color, and I would much rather listen to that than almost in any situation a bel canto singer.
Yes, and we should say that singer is Anna Snow in that recording.
Yeah.
It's just a really interesting combination. I love the drums with it. It feels when I first heard this, I didn't realize that there was a second performer, and I was really hoping that the singer was playing these very relatively simple. It would be possible to sing and play both parts, as would have been done by Troubadours in France, and
or as would have been done by Phil Collins in the 1970s.
Sure. I'm going for the connection with the album title, but whatever.
No, Phil Collins
whatever
played
floats
drums.
your boat.
He played drums and sang with Genesis, you boob.
That's also true.
That is true. And Dave, we got to educate Dave. It's expensive education, and you don't even know Phil Collins played drums.
Well, I mean, I didn't know that Troubadours played percussion as they were singing either.
Oh, I didn't know that either, actually.
So there.
They played whatever instrument they had to accompany themselves.
Right.
Anyway.
And we need to point out, I think Dave pointed out that the spelling of that word that's going to show up in our show notes.
It's not the way that I normally see it spelled, but that's not to say that it's wrong, because it's a very old word. And
I'm making no claim about correct or not correct. I'm just saying that's the way it's spelled on her website.
Right.
So
and on
if
the album
you have an issue with it, take it up with her. Visit her website even if you don't have an issue with it.
So it's a great piece. You should absolutely check it out. We're going to wrap this one up. It's going a little long already. But Drew, thank you so much for joining us this week. It's been great talking to you.
It's always fun. Thanks for having me.
We're really always learn something when we have you on the show, and I think we certainly learned a lot today. And if you at home would like to learn some more about what Drew does, you should check him out at adaptration.com and orchestraconsulting.com. And he has a whole empire of blogs and projects over at Inside the Arts. Is there anything you have coming up on any of your many fronts that you'd like to plug?
Well, inside the Adaptration Network, the cartoon site, Who's Minding the Score, has actually gotten really good because it's all about concert halls, and there's some fantastic ones coming up in the next couple of weeks. It's published every Sunday.
Okay.
That's a good one to go to.
Awesome.
So we'll be sure to check that out for sure.
No composers there yet, but today they introduced a music librarian character.
Oh, dear. Oh, man.
I read that one this morning, Drew, actually. It showed up on Facebook.
Well, I'm going to not say anything because I love music librarians who prepare scores to give to orchestras. But I will look forward to reading that cartoon. Thank you so much for pointing that out. We record this show and stream it live every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and we were very close to on time this week. So if you would like to watch the live stream, participate with us in chat, you can do that on our site, soundnotion.tv/live. If you're watching this after the fact and you'd like to comment on the show, or if you'd like any links to any of the stories that we talked about, we'll have all of that information for you and a lot more at soundnotion.tv/SN. So be sure to head over there and check that out. You can also connect with us on Facebook or Twitter. We're at SoundNotion on Twitter. This show and all our shows, of course, are available in the iTunes Store, so be sure to head over there and subscribe for free to every episode. Download it automatically to your favorite device. SoundNotion's introduction includes music by Pedro Gullo and video by Tyler Lapp. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you back next week.